Well, hello everybody and welcome along to this video. Mr. Johnson teaches war photographer revision. As always, a reminder that this is part of your GCSE English Literature exam. It's on paper 2 and it's section B on paper 2. You will be given a question by the exam board and they will print a poem as part of that question, and then it's up to you to choose a second poem that you think best answers the question and that you can compare to the one that you've been given. It may well be that war photographer is the one that they print in the exam. It may well be that you choose war photographer. I would not be surprised if you did. It's a good poem which makes lots of comparisons, or good comparisons, to other poems. So let's get going with this video and start making some notes. You'll need to be ready to pause this video as we go along. Revision is all about being active, so don't just listen. Have a pen and paper and ideally a copy of the poem ready to go. And with that in mind, in fact, make sure you've got a copy of the poem somewhere. It's really important. If you've got your anthology, brilliant. If you can print one off, brilliant. If not, you could certainly write one out. Anyway, you will be able to find it. If you search for war photographer and Duffy, that will lead you to a copy of this poem. So pause this, get yourself ready with a copy of the poem, and then let's move along with it. You'll want to read this poem to yourself first. Make sure you're familiar with it, otherwise this video isn't going to be much help to you. Oh, gone too far. So again, if you haven't done so, you can pause the video now, please, and just read the poem through once. And let's get started making some notes. So, Ann Duffy, as you can see there, she's a living poet, certainly probably one of the greatest living poets in Britain at the current moment. Born in 1955, Scotland. She writes plays as well as poems. Poet laureate, so she was selected to be Britain's poetry writer for if there were big moments in the country. She was given the role of writing a poem, and she did write a number of poems to do with different national events. You can find those if you Google for them. And then her poetry, just worth noting in some ways really, she's been in the AQA anthology since their beginning. There's been a number of them over the years. I'm old enough to have been doing my exams many years ago, and even I managed to study some Ann Duffy poems. Worth knowing that her poetry explores violence and identity are two key themes which come through in her poetry, and certainly I think one of those themes certainly matches in War Photographer. And also, to give you a little bit more context, so like you've hopefully just made some notes about Ann Duffy herself, worth writing down somewhere on your page notes about where this poem actually came from. She was inspired to write this poem following her friendship with two photographers. One of them particularly is Don McCullen, and he's the man you can see photographed there. I think that's a fantastic black and white photograph. As it says in the notes there, he's recognised as one of Britain's greatest living photographers, particularly also for his photojournalism is what it's called. So when journalists or people go off and take photographs of particular events happening, not just wars, but photojournalism, he went to a number of war zones, and therefore the photographer in the poem isn't actually Don McCullen, but certainly inspired by him. Google him, go off and have a look at some of his photographs. Like Duffy, these photographers, it says, are trying to capture a truth. So they're trying to photograph a truth, and Duffy is trying to write about a truth, or certainly lead us to understanding a truth. They certainly don't tell us, but they want us to try and work out and understand these truths. So there you go, a bit of context for the poem for you. Think about the title. Titles matter. This one is certainly very simple and very descriptive, and perhaps it's about talking. It's almost putting them in the centre. The title, War Photographer, makes us actually think about the photographers, because so often we are looking at the photographs they take, but not thinking about who is behind the lens and who it is taking those. And the fact that it's War Photographer and there is no name given to this poet, perhaps you could argue that that is important in itself. Just photographer. So let's go through. Be ready to make notes. I am making a revision video for you. I won't be able to talk about every single thing. I will try and draw your attention to certain key bits of information that allow you to make some notes. Firstly, the photograph here illustrates what a darkroom is, because a number of you will almost certainly be unfamiliar with the idea of developing a photo in this world of digital where you just snap and then it's instantly there. For many, many years, you took a photograph onto film. That film then needed to be developed using chemicals, and then you would take those negatives and then actually blow them up into photographs and then you'd have to go through a process. As the man in the trays is doing right there were 3 trays with 3 different chemicals. Each one of those helped the photograph to develop, and it went from white paper, where you'd actually you projected your photo onto this white photosensitive paper, and then each chemical meant it slowly revealed, which almost is quite ghost-like, and you actually hear about that in the poem. If you're interested, go on YouTube. I bet you could find a video about the photo developing process. So back to the poem. Stanza 1. In his dark room he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. I draw your attention to the S sounds there. So there's lots of S sounds in this stanza, sibilants coming through, suggesting a very soft tone. The fact it's very sort of eerie, we're in this red room, that's what a dark room would be. So you could see it's actually got a red bulb because it doesn't affect the photography process. And it's though he were in a church. He takes his work that seriously, but also because it's very silent in these rooms as well. Like a priest, and he is a priest, preparing to intone a mass. A priest, like a vicar, preparing to almost do something very important and almost religious. And then we've got this listing going on here: Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. These are all war zones, conflict zones, perhaps zones that this photographer has visited. All flesh is grass is certainly an unusual line there as well. It's actually a quote from the Bible, talking about how human life is temporary, isn't to last, and maybe that sets up the tone of the poem. There's also a structure to this poem as well. In that one you've got loads of O sounds: alone, rose, glows, and also mass and grass, or grass depending on your pronunciation of it, like hints of rhyme, maybe almost linking to sort of the memories coming through. Having the rhyme, this repeating sound, is almost like, maybe you could argue, the repeating memories that he has in his head. By looking at these photos, he's seen these images once when he took them, he's now revisiting these images as he develops them. So like the revisiting, the repetition of seeing them is almost like the repetition of structure of the rhyme in this poem, you could argue. He has a job to do. Solution, slop in trace, and that's the chemicals that because you had to move the trays up and down to make the chemicals wash over the image that you were developing. Beneath his hands, which do not tremble then, or did not tremble then, sorry, though seem to now. So like going through these memories, almost causing him to revisit them, making his hands shake, almost suggesting perhaps a form of PTSD. Don't just label it as PTSD as such, it's not that simple, but you could argue it. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel. Fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in nightmare heat. There's that rhyme again, there's a regular rhyme scheme in this poem. It almost suggests the picture which you can see on the screen here. This is a famous photograph taken during the Vietnam War. Let me just see, who is it? I haven't got the photographer's name in front of me. It is a very famous image taken from a bombing of a village. That girl's clothes have been ripped off by the explosion that's taken place there. But again, reliving these horrible memories, running children in nightmare heat. Look at the language there of exploding beneath the feet. There's lots of really violent imagery going on here. So we've gone for a very soft first stanza and immediately juxtaposed that with this second stanza, which contains some horrible imagery, some very violent imagery, perhaps you could argue. Something is happening. Now it's talking here about the process. As I've mentioned, this photograph lying in this tray of chemicals, it's slowly developing. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. Interesting use of the word twist. If something twists, it feels very uncomfortable. It almost has a very negative connotation to it. A half-formed ghost. Double meaning going on there. The image might look a bit like a ghost because it sort of appears and isn't there but is there, but also the fact it's a ghost, this stranger's features perhaps suggesting the photograph he took of this person has now died. So we've got that double meaning. Look at the caesura there, stopping us in the middle of the line awkwardly, and then continuing, he remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval, like how he asked for her permission to take this photograph. And then you've got this blood stained into foreign dust. That almost contains like a link to blood shadow from Remains for me there as well. Either way, again, we've got a little bit of violent imagery again going on there. The idea of memories sort of appearing, the way this photograph develops and comes through, almost like the memories come through in his head. 100 agonies in black and white. So we're talking about black and white photos here, and there's 100 agonies. So not photographs, the word is agonies. And agony is a very strong word with strong connotations of pain, discomfort. It's a really negative word, you could say. So all these hundreds of photographs, his editor, the guy in charge, will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday supplement. The photograph there on the screen there has got a newspaper. Particularly on Sundays, you get these big glossy magazines added in. The idea being that people have got more time on Sundays to read the papers, and then they've got extra magazines in there for people to read. So inside this Sunday supplement is going to be some of our photographers' photographs. 5 or 6 from the 100 agonies. There's a real juxtaposition between the 100 and the 5 or 6 there, almost showing just despite all the work and all the suffering that he's seen, it's reduced down into just 5 or 6, almost making it seem a bit worthless, perhaps you could argue. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. So yeah, it makes people cry, but then they're in the bath and then they're off to go and get some beers before they have their Sunday lunches, almost making these events seem worthless. And then from the aeroplane, he stares impassively, sort of like almost glossed over his eyes at where he earns his living, and they do not care, they being us. We almost are switched off and almost don't realise what's going on. Desensitise is perhaps a really good word to be using there as well. He certainly seems frustrated by this as well. They prick with tears, and then those tears are gone. Like a tears pricking to suggest that it's not something that's lasting, that we don't really sort of dwell on these things enough, maybe. And then he's going off and risking his life and taking these photographs. Let's move on and have a look at this then. Just some key images for you. That is a spool of photography of negatives, and they would be put into a camera, basically an old-fashioned camera. So when it talks about spools of suffering, when something winds around something, that is a spool, and that's what I've tried to show you there. That is film, is the word I was trying to come up with a minute ago. Film that would be loaded into a camera, and then you would then use a process to then develop your film, and it would then start looking something like this. These are called negatives. So these are black is white and white is black inside these, and then when you then do a process which then produces a photograph from this, and that turns the black into white and the white back into black, so the photograph looks as it should. Either way, that's what film would look like, and then you would have all of these and then choose the photographs by looking. These are little, by the way, they're about 35mm high. It's why it's called 35mm film. And there's the process as well, so like 100 agonies in black and white hanging up there. You would then choose your photographs from these images. Here are some questions for you to consider, please. Pause this video and use these questions to help you analyse your poem and also annotate your poem in a little bit more detail. It's particularly focusing on the photographer. Think about what we're being taught in this poem, how we're being shown, making us almost reflect on ourselves and think about, do we really think about all these images that we see, or are we becoming desensitised and switched off to them? Comparisons. I haven't got a huge amount of time left on this video. You could make comparisons maybe between other people suffering in war, be it soldiers, like the soldier in Remains perhaps, who's suffering, and particularly suffering after the war. Maybe bayonet charge, you've got a very different thing, because bayonet charge contains the actions of a soldier in war. This is a person after the war, which is what makes them quite good to compare, because they're different. Also, bayonet charge is about a soldier, as is Remains, whereas this is a different perspective. Maybe you could talk about Poppies as well, because Poppies is a very different perspective of war. The person left behind, and in war photographer it's the person who's gone there but then comes back, and they are both very soft in their tone as well. A question you could consider answering as part of your revision notes here: how does Duffy explore the lasting effects of conflict? So think about the effects of war that go on afterwards, they last. I've got a pair paragraph coming up to show you in a second. I've said in the middle there, perhaps when you write yours, you could look at disturbing imagery and talk about how that has an effect on him. Maybe the hints of rhyme, which I mentioned earlier, almost like the memories leaking in, like that rhyme that keeps coming back through the poem is almost like his memories which keep coming back. And I've just got enough time to point out to you here. The blue is where I've sort of answered the question and talked about the poem a little bit. Then I've picked out a method. In this example I've chosen structure for you. The green I've tried to evidence, because it's not always about quotes, I've tried to put evidence of the structure for you. Then I've tried to analyse it and talk about in red what effect it or what it shows. Finally, purple is bigger there. This is the really important bit because it shows your understanding of what the poet's trying to teach us. That is me going to sign out here. Go back through the video, pause it for yourself. It just remains for me to say good luck whenever your exams may be, because you may be watching this video in year 9 or year 10 or year 11. All the best. Take your time. Remember, exams are an opportunity for you to show what you know. Good luck, everybody.